No one warned her about the silence, not the silence of empty rooms. She had expected that. Not the silence of a husband who had already left before she arrived. She had prepared for that too. What no one warned her about was the specific silence of a castle that had been deliberately emptied of warmth. Stone by stone, room by room, window by window sealed shut against the light. Someone had done that on purpose, and that someone had just made her the lady of this place, given her a title, a set of iron keys, and a carriage headed north, without once looking her in the eye long enough to apologize for it. Most women would have written home within the first week. Seraphine didn't write home. She opened the windows, and what happened after that? What a woman does when she is handed the coldest, emptiest version of a life and simply decides to make it into something, is the kind of story that doesn't follow the rules you expect it to. Stay. Because this one is different. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. Those who witnessed it would later say it was the most elegant wedding of the season. The flowers were perfect. The gowns were exquisite. The chandelier cast light across the marble floor like something out of a painting. But anyone who looked closely enough would have noticed that the Duke of Ashvern never once turned to face his bride during the vows. He stood with his shoulders squared, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the altar, as though the whole affair were a business transaction he simply needed to endure. Seraphine Voss had known, of course. She had known from the moment her father placed the contract on the dining table 3 weeks prior, his hands trembling not with emotion, but with relief. The Voss name carried history, beautiful, crumbling history, and the Duke of Ashvern carried the kind of wealth that could silence every creditor in England without blinking. It was not a love match. It was not even a kind match. It was a transfer of obligation, and she had signed her name to it with steady hands and a heart she had already quietly folded away. What she had not expected was the title itself. Not Duchess of Ashvern. That much she had prepared for. What she had not prepared for was the way he said it to her for the first time, in the carriage after the ceremony, without looking up from the document in his hands. You will be addressed as Lady Ashvern of Korath, the Northern Estate. Not London, not the grand Ashvern Hall the papers always mentioned. The Northern Estate, a name she had never heard, in a place no one in her circle had ever visited. She looked out the carriage window at the gray afternoon sky and understood, without needing to be told, exactly what kind of title she had just been given. If something in those first few minutes already feels familiar, the quiet of being placed somewhere and expected to simply stay quiet, then you already understand Seraphine better than most people in her world ever did. Subscribe to DukeDom Stories and turn on the bell, because this story is told in layers, and every chapter earns the next one. Don't let it find you halfway through. Now, back to Korath. The windows are still closed, and Seraphine has just arrived. Corrath Castle appeared on the horizon like a wound in the landscape. Dark stone rising against a pewter sky, surrounded by moorland so flat and silent, it felt less like a setting and more like a sentence. The carriage slowed as they approached the iron gates, and Seraphine leaned forward slightly, studying the structure with the careful attention she had always used when entering rooms where she was not wanted. The towers were intact, the walls were solid, but the ivy had grown so thick across the eastern facade that it had begun to swallow the lower windows whole, as though the land itself had decided to reclaim what the Duke had abandoned. The staff that received her numbered 4, a mordomo with careful eyes and a carefully neutral expression, 2 housemaids who curtsied without meeting her gaze, and a groundskeeper who acknowledged her arrival by removing his hat and then immediately replacing it. No one smiled. No one offered a word of welcome that wasn't strictly required by protocol. Seraphine descended from the carriage, straightened her coat against the northern wind, and looked up at the castle's main entrance. A set of double doors so heavy they had to be pushed open by two people working together. She walked through them alone. She would learn, in the days that followed, what Corrath Castle had been before her arrival. Not a home. Not even a residence, in any meaningful sense. It was where the Duke of Ashvern sent things he no longer wished to deal with. Outdated furniture, forgotten correspondence, distant relatives who had overstayed their welcome in London. And now, apparently, a wife. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Aldrin, who spoke in precise, clipped sentences and never volunteered information unless asked directly, confirmed it without meaning to on Seraphine's third day, when she referred to Korath as the estate where things are kept. She said it simply, without malice. That was almost worse. The bedroom assigned to her was at the end of the longest corridor in the east wing, 3 turns away from the main staircase, and far enough from any other occupied room that silence there was not merely the absence of sound. It was a presence of its own. The fireplace worked. The bed was dressed in linens that smelled of cedar and long storage. The single candelabra on the writing desk held 4 candles, 2 of which had already burned down to their bases and had not been replaced. Seraphine sat on the edge of the bed in her traveling clothes and did not move for a long time. She did not cry. She had made herself a quiet promise in the carriage that she would not spend her first night at Korath in tears, and she intended to keep it, not out of pride exactly, but out of something more practical. Tears required energy, and energy was something she was going to need far more urgently in the weeks ahead. She looked around the room instead, cataloging it the way she had always cataloged difficult situations. What was broken, what was salvageable, what could be made to work with enough patience and enough will. The answer, she decided, was most of it. What stayed with her longest that night was not the cold or the dark or the wind pressing against the window glass like something asking to be let in. It was the silence from the rest of the castle, total, indifferent, unbothered by her presence. Somewhere in this building there were rooms that had once held conversation, warmth, the ordinary sounds of a household that considered itself alive. She could feel their absence the way you feel the absence of furniture in a room you've only just entered. Not as emptiness exactly, but as the shape of something that used to be there. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, looked at the ceiling, and decided that silence, at least, was something she knew how to answer. By the end of the first week, Seraphine had developed a reliable sense of what Korath's small staff had been told to expect. They were polite, unfailingly, almost mechanically polite. But their politeness had the particular texture of people who had been instructed to be accommodating rather than people who actually wished to accommodate. They answered her questions with the minimum necessary information. They completed their tasks efficiently and without invitation for further conversation. They treated her, she realized, the way one treats a guest who everyone knows will not be staying long. Mrs. Aldrin was the most transparent about it, in her way. On the 4th morning, when Seraphine asked about the possibility of having the dining room fire lit for breakfast rather than eating in her room, the housekeeper's pause before answering lasted just a fraction too long. "I'll see to it, my lady," she said finally, with the tone of someone filing away an unexpected request. Later that afternoon, Seraphine overheard 2 of the housemaids in the corridor, not arguing, not gossiping exactly, just recalibrating. "She asked about the east garden as well," one of them said, "as if she means to stay." The other one said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. What none of them had prepared for was the fact that she did mean to stay. Not out of devotion to a husband who had already returned to London without saying goodbye, and not out of any particular attachment to cold stone and moorland wind. She meant to stay because she had nowhere else to go, and because she had spent enough of her life being treated as temporary to know that the only answer to it was to become undeniably permanent. She did not announce this. She did not need to. She simply began, on the morning of the 5th day, to learn every room in the castle by name. It started with the drawing room on the ground floor, a large south-facing room that received more light than any other space in the castle but had, for reasons no one seemed able to articulate, been kept shuttered for what appeared to be several years. The curtains were heavy damask, dark green faded to gray at the folds, and they had been drawn so long that the fabric had begun to rot slightly at the edges where it pooled on the floor. Seraphine walked in on a Tuesday morning, assessed the room for approximately 30 seconds, and then crossed to the nearest window and pushed it open. The sound of the latch releasing echoed in the empty room. Cold air and gray morning light came flooding in together, and the dust that had been sitting undisturbed on every surface rose in a slow, silent cloud. Seraphine sneezed, covered her mouth with her sleeve, and opened the second window. Then the third. By the time Mrs. Aldrin appeared in the doorway, all 4 windows were open, the curtains had been pushed back as far as they would go, and Seraphine was standing in the center of the room looking at the ceiling with the focused expression of someone making a list. "My lady, the Duke prefers these rooms," Mrs. Aldrin began. Seraphine turned to look at her, not unkindly, but without any suggestion that the sentence was going to change anything. "The Duke is in London," she said simply, "and this room needs air." She returned her attention to the ceiling. Mrs. Aldrin stood in the doorway for a moment longer, then withdrew without completing her sentence. It was, Seraphine would later recognize, the first small negotiation she won at Korath, not by argument, not by authority, but by the simple and apparently radical act of deciding that certain things were going to be different now. She had opened the windows, cleared the drawing room, learned every room in the castle by name, and not once, not a single time, had anyone told her she was allowed to do any of it. But here is what no one at Korath had understood yet. The woman they had been waiting to leave was quietly, methodically, making herself impossible to remove, and somewhere in London, the man who had sent her here had not yet thought about her once. That was about to change, because something was happening inside these walls that no cold title and no empty castle had been designed to survive. And the first sign of it, the very first crack in everything he had built to keep this place hollow, was already waiting for him in the East Garden. He just didn't know it yet. The West Wing had no official prohibition attached to it. There was no lock on the corridor door, no written instruction, no formal word from the Duke before his departure. And yet, within her first 2 weeks at Korath, Seraphine had noticed that not a single member of staff ever walked through that door willingly. The housemaids cleaned up to the corridor's edge and stopped. The groundskeeper, when asked about the west-facing garden visible from her bedroom window, looked briefly at the door and then back at her with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite grief, but something that lived between the two. She asked Mrs. Aldrin directly on a Wednesday afternoon, choosing the moment carefully, after tea, when the housekeeper was most relaxed, when the wind outside had softened and the castle felt almost gentle. "The West Wing," Seraphine said, setting down her cup. "Why does no one go there?" Mrs. Aldrin's hands stilled over the tray she was clearing. The pause that followed was the longest one Seraphine had yet observed from her. "It was the late Duchess's wing, my lady," she said finally, her voice carrying the specific flatness of someone reciting a fact they have decided to present as the entirety of the truth. His Grace has not permitted it to be entered since her passing. Seraphine did not press further that afternoon. She had learned enough about Korath by then to understand that information here did not yield to force. It yielded to patience, and to the kind of quiet attention that made people eventually forget they were being observed. But she filed the answer away carefully, because it explained more than Mrs. Aldrin had intended it to. It explained the particular quality of the castle's silence, not the silence of a place that had never been warm, but the silence of a place that had been warm once, and had been deliberately, methodically closed against warmth ever since. That was a different thing entirely, and it told her something about the man who had sent her here that the wedding ceremony never had. The letter arrived on a grey Friday morning, carried by a courier who had ridden from London and looked as though he had not slept. It bore the Duke of Ashvern's seal, black wax, precise impression, the kind of seal that expected to be obeyed, and it contained 3 paragraphs written in a hand so controlled it barely looked human. The first paragraph confirmed that he had arranged for a quarterly household allowance to be sent to Korath. The second specified that the allowance was to be used for staff wages and essential maintenance only. The third informed her, in language so formal it almost obscured its own meaning, that the East Garden was to remain in its current state and was not to be altered in any way without his written approval. Seraphine read the letter twice, then she folded it neatly, set it on the writing desk beside the window, and looked out at the East Garden, a long rectangular space that had once clearly been designed with intention and care, but which had been left untended for long enough that the original structure was only visible in outline, like a drawing someone had started and then abandoned. The boxwood hedges had grown shapeless. The gravel paths had been overtaken by grass at their edges. In the far corner, the remains of what appeared to have been a rose garden stood in a tangle of unpruned canes, leafless and gray against the stone wall. She went outside that same afternoon, not to defy him, or not only to defy him, but because the garden was suffering in a way that had nothing to do with aesthetic preference and everything to do with basic neglect, and because she had discovered, in the weeks since her arrival, that she could not watch things suffer unnecessarily when she had the means to help them. She did not tear anything out. She did not redesign. She simply began clearing the worst of the overgrowth from around the rose canes with a pair of garden shears she found in the groundskeeper's shed, working quietly and methodically until the light began to fail. She did not write back to London. She did not ask for written approval. When the groundskeeper found her there the following morning and offered, after a long hesitation, to help, she accepted without comment, and they worked together in companionable silence until noon. The small sitting room off the main corridor had been used, as far as Seraphine could determine, as a repository for furniture that didn't belong anywhere else, an accumulation of mismatched chairs, rolled carpets leaning against the walls, 3 side tables stacked on top of each other, 2 portraits facing inward so that only their wooden backs were visible. It was the kind of room that announces, without apology, that no one has thought about it in a very long time. Seraphine thought about it for 3 days before she touched anything. What she did was not decoration. She had no budget for decoration and no particular interest in performing elegance for a castle that currently had an audience of 4 staff members and a great deal of empty sky. What she did was closer to archaeology, carefully moving each piece to discover what was underneath, identifying what was genuinely damaged beyond use and setting it aside, finding what was simply forgotten and restoring it to purpose. The carpet beneath the stacked furniture turned out to be a deep burgundy wool in near-perfect condition, protected by everything piled on top of it. The 2 portraits, turned to face the room, revealed themselves to be landscapes, moorland and coastline, painted with real feeling, that filled the walls with color and distance. One of the chairs, reupholstered with fabric, she cut from a damaged curtain in the unused guest room down the hall, became the most comfortable seat in the castle. Mrs. Aldrin walked past the open door on a Thursday morning and stopped. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the room, the light coming through the now clean windows, the carpet laid properly, the landscapes on the walls, the small fire Seraphine had lit in the grate. Her expression shifted in a way that was difficult to name precisely, somewhere between recognition and something more unguarded. "I had forgotten that carpet was in here," she said quietly, almost to herself. Seraphine looked up from the book she had opened in the restored chair. "It's a good one," she said simply. Mrs. Aldrin nodded once, slowly, and moved on down the corridor. But the next morning, without being asked, she sent one of the housemaids to clean the sitting room windows from the outside. It was the first thing anyone at Korath had done for Seraphine without being directly requested. He had not intended to stay. That was what the Duke of Ashvern told himself, as his carriage turned off the northern road and began the approach to Korath in the last pale light of a late afternoon. He was passing through, attending to a land matter in the neighboring county, and it was more practical to stop at the estate than to continue to the inn at Whitmore. It was a reasonable explanation. He had offered it to no one, because there was no one to offer it to, but he rehearsed it anyway, with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the stories we tell ourselves require the same maintenance as any other structure. He saw the windows from the gate. That was what stopped the rehearsal. Korath's windows had always been dark on his approaches. He had ensured it, in a way, by ensuring that no one at the estate had reason or invitation to make it otherwise. But the ground-floor windows of the south-facing drawing room were lit from within, warm and steady against the gray evening, and as the carriage rolled closer, he could see that the curtains he had kept drawn for 4 years had been pulled fully back. Light was spilling onto the gravel in long, pale rectangles. It looked from the gate almost like a house that someone lived in. He said nothing to the driver. He said nothing when he descended from the carriage and stood for a moment on the gravel, looking at the lit windows with an expression that the driver, very carefully, did not look at. He said nothing when Mrs. Aldrin met him at the door with a composure that suggested she was not entirely surprised by his arrival, which meant, he noted, that she had adjusted her understanding of Korath to include the possibility of his return, and that adjustment had not come from him. He walked through the entrance hall, which smelled faintly of beeswax and something green, cut stems, perhaps, or garden soil, and stopped at the door of the drawing room. Inside, seated at the writing desk with a lamp lit beside her and 3 books open in front of her, was his wife. She looked up when she heard his step. She did not startle. She did not rise immediately. She simply looked at him with calm, clear eyes and said, "Your Grace, I wasn't told to expect you." The tone was not reproachful. It was simply accurate. He had intended to eat in his study, a cold supper, something simple, the kind of meal that required nothing of the household and nothing of him. He had communicated this to Mrs. Aldrin within 20 minutes of his arrival, using the same precise, minimal language he used for all Korath correspondence. Mrs. Aldrin had nodded and withdrawn. He had considered the matter settled and turned his attention to the land documents he had brought from London. He came downstairs an hour later because one of the documents required a signature from the estate ledger, which was kept in the library on the ground floor. To reach the library from his study, he had to pass the dining room. The dining room door was open. The dining room, which he had not entered in 4 years, and which had, in his memory, The particular atmosphere of a room that has accepted its own disuse was lit by candles, not the full chandelier, but a grouping of candlesticks arranged down the center of the table with the kind of considered placement that suggested someone had thought about where the light would fall. The table was set for two. Not elaborately. There was no performance in it. No attempt at formality beyond what the occasion actually required. But set with care, with the good linen he had forgotten Korath possessed, and with a small arrangement of branches and late winter berries at the center that had clearly come from the east garden. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he heard her step on the staircase behind him, unhurried, unannounced, and turned to find Seraphine descending in a dress that was simple and well-chosen and entirely appropriate for a private dinner in a northern castle, as though she had given the matter exactly the right amount of thought and no more. "Mrs. Aldrin mentioned you preferred a cold supper in your study," she said, pausing at the foot of the staircase. "I thought you might prefer a warm one in the dining room, but the choice is yours." She said it without challenge, without performance, with the same straightforward attention to practicality she brought to everything at Korath. He looked at the table. He looked at her. He walked into the dining room and sat down. It was the first meal he had eaten in that room since his first wife died, and he did not say a single word about it, and neither did she. And somehow that made it easier than anything else could have. A table set for two, a husband who came back without warning, and a woman who didn't flinch when he walked through the door. Seraphine didn't do any of this to be noticed. She did it because she had decided, quietly and without announcement, that this place deserved to be alive. The question now is, did he notice anyway? If you're not subscribed yet, do it now, because what comes next is the part of the story where everything underneath the surface finally starts to move. Hit the bell. Don't miss it. We're only halfway there. He found her in the east garden on the morning of his third day at Korath, which was already one day longer than he had planned to stay. She was working along the far wall where the rose canes had been, doing something precise and unhurried with a length of twine and a set of small wooden stakes. Her coat dark against the pale winter stone behind her. He had told himself he was walking to inspect the groundskeeper's recent work on the northern drainage. The east garden was not on that route. He walked into it anyway. He watched her for a moment before she heard him, long enough to notice that she worked the way she did everything at Korath, with a quiet competence that drew no attention to itself and required no audience. She was not performing industry. She was simply doing what needed to be done, in the way that suggested she had already decided it needed doing long before anyone else had considered the question. When she finally looked up and found him standing there, she straightened without haste and waited, which was another thing she did that he had not encountered often. She did not fill silences with nervous words. She simply waited in them, as though silence were a perfectly reasonable place to stand. "Why are you still here?" he said. He had not planned to say it, or not in those exact words, which were blunter than he intended and carried a weight he had not prepared to examine. Seraphine looked at him for a moment with that clear, unhurried attention of hers. "You sent me here," she said. "Yes," he said. I didn't expect you to stay." She tilted her head very slightly, the way someone does when they are deciding how honest to be. "I know," she said. That was rather obvious. And then she returned to her twine and her stakes with the air of someone who had answered the question fully and saw no need to elaborate, leaving him standing in the garden with the strange and uncomfortable sensation of having started a conversation he did not know how to finish. He brought it up again that evening, in the sitting room she had restored, which he had walked past twice now, and both times found himself pausing at the doorway longer than was strictly necessary. He had intended to spend the evening with his correspondence. Instead, he found himself standing at the fireplace, in a room that smelled of beeswax and old wool, and the particular quietness of a space that had been cared for. And he said, without fully understanding why he was continuing this line of inquiry, "Most women in your position would have written to their families, requested a removal to London, found the arrangement intolerable." Seraphine was sitting in the restored chair with a book open in her lap. She did not look up immediately. When she did, her expression was the thoughtful, measuring kind, not guarded, not careful in the way of someone managing him, but genuinely considering how to say something true. "Most women in my position," she said, "were not given a castle." He frowned slightly. "I gave you an empty one." She nodded once, acknowledging this without disputing it. "Yes," she said. "Empty things have the advantage of not requiring you to work around what someone else has already decided they should be." He was quiet for a moment. It was not the answer he had expected. He had expected either complaint or performance, the two registers he had encountered most reliably in women who had been given less than they were promised. What he had not expected was that particular quality of contentment, genuine and unforced, from a woman sitting alone in a restored room in a castle at the edge of the moors with a husband who had placed her there as an afterthought. He looked around the room again, the carpet, the landscapes, the arrangement of dried stems in a jar on the side table, and felt something he could not immediately name, something adjacent to discomfort, but not quite the same. "You're not what I expected either," he said finally, not intending it as a compliment, though it landed as one. Seraphine simply turned back to her book, and the fire crackled between them, and neither of them moved to leave. She had been using the library since her second week at Korath. It was the warmest room on the ground floor and the best supplied, with shelves that covered 3 walls floor to ceiling and a window seat wide enough to actually sit in with a book and a blanket. She had worked her way through the shelves methodically, reading what interested her and cataloging what didn't, and she had found nothing unusual until the morning she reached the section on the far wall behind the writing desk, where the shelves were older and the books more densely packed, and the dust suggested that even Korath's forgotten corners had a forgotten corner of their own. The journal was shelved between 2 volumes of agricultural records, which was either very deliberate or very accidental, and she could not determine which. It was bound in dark green leather, its pages soft with age, and it bore no name on the cover, only the Ashvern crest embossed in faded gold and, beneath it, a date range spanning 7 years ending 4 years ago. She did not open it immediately. She held it for a long time, feeling its weight, understanding what it almost certainly was. A private record, something that had been placed here either to be hidden or to be forgotten, and she was not certain there was a meaningful difference between the two. She did read it. She told herself she would read only enough to understand what it was, and then put it back. But the truth was, she read every page, slowly and carefully, over the course of 2 days. And what she found was not what she had steeled herself for. It was not a record of coldness. It was not the self-justifying chronicle of a difficult man explaining his own behavior. It was the private record of someone who had loved with a completeness that had left him entirely unprepared for loss, and who had responded to that loss by dismantling, with great deliberateness and precision, every structure inside himself that was capable of being hurt again. She closed the journal on the final page and sat very still in the library for a long time. When she finally rose and replaced it on the shelf, she handled it with a care that was different from the care she had used when she first found it. She now understood what she was handling. He had spent 4 years at Korath without flowers. This was not an oversight. It was a preference he had communicated, in the early months after the funeral, with the kind of quiet finality that people understood was not to be revisited. Mrs. Aldrin had adapted without comment. The gardens had been left to their own devices. Whatever the estate had once grown in its glasshouse had been removed or left to die, and Korath had settled into the particular sensory register of cold stone and wood smoke, and the clean, empty smell of moorland wind through imperfectly sealed windows. He did not know, when he retired on the fourth night of his unexpected stay, that Seraphine had spent the afternoon in the walled section of the east garden, where, it turned out, a small group of very early narcissi had pushed through the cleared ground at the base of the south-facing wall. She had brought a few stems inside, not many, not a grand arrangement, just a handful in a narrow glass on the hall table outside the door to the east corridor. Because they were there, and they were living, and it seemed to her a small cruelty to leave them entirely unacknowledged. She had not thought about proximity to his study. She had not thought about him at all, particularly. He was aware of the scent before he was fully awake, a thread of it reaching him through the not-quite-closed door at the end of the corridor, faint and specific and entirely out of place in a castle that had not smelled of flowers in 4 years. He lay still for a long time in the dark, not getting up, not opening the door, trying to place the feeling that had arrived with it. Not grief, or not only grief, but something sitting beside grief that he did not immediately have a name for. It was the smell of a house that someone was living in, the smell of a person who noticed small things and acted on them without asking permission and without requiring anyone to thank her for it. He lay there until the feeling passed, which it did not, quite. And when he finally rose the following morning, he walked past the narrow glass without looking at it directly, which was not the same as not noticing it. The letter from her sister arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded from London with a week's delay and a crumpled corner that suggested it had been handled more than once along the way. Seraphine read it at the writing desk in her room, with the morning light coming through the window she kept open even in cold weather. And when she finished, she set it down and looked out at the moor for a long time without moving. Her sister Margot was unwell, not gravely, not yet, but unwell in the persistent, draining way that required company and practical help and the specific comfort of family, and Margot had no one else to ask. The letter was not a demand. It was the kind of careful, apologetic request that people make when they have already decided they have no right to ask, but find themselves asking anyway. Seraphine spent the rest of the morning thinking about it, with the same methodical honesty she brought to every problem at Korath. She had responsibilities here, or she had made herself responsibilities here, which was not quite the same thing, but felt close enough to count. The garden was only beginning to recover. The sitting rooms still needed work in the upper shelving. Mrs. Aldrin had, in the past week, begun to show the early signs of thawing into something that might eventually become genuine conversation. None of it was hers by legal claim. All of it was hers by the investment of her own attention and care, which she had come to believe was the only kind of ownership that actually meant anything. And yet Margot was her sister. She had nearly finished the letter to Mrs. Aldrin outlining the household arrangements for her absence when the Duke appeared in the doorway of the sitting room where she had moved to write. She had not heard him come down the corridor. He looked at the letter in her hand and then at her face with an attention that was sharper than she had expected from a man who had spent most of his time at Korath, carefully not looking at anything directly. "You're leaving," he said. It was not a question. Seraphine folded the letter with a precision that gave her a moment to decide how to answer. "My sister needs me," she said. "I'll be back within the month if that suits the estate." The phrase, "if that suits the estate and not if that suits you," was not accidental, and she thought, from the slight shift in his expression, that he heard the distinction. He said nothing for a moment. Then, in a tone that was careful in a way she had not heard from him before, he said, "I'll still be here." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them elaborated, and the weight of what had not been said filled the room with more substance than most conversations manage with every word accounted for. She had packed a bag, written the letter, chosen her sister over a castle that wasn't truly hers, and he had stood in that doorway with the expression of a man who had just heard a door close inside himself that he hadn't known was open. "I'll still be here." 3 words, quietly spoken, entirely unplanned, from a man who had spent 4 years making certain that no one, nothing, had any reason to expect him anywhere. Now ask yourself this. A duke who sends a wife away without looking back, what does it mean when he suddenly needs her to know he isn't leaving? What changed inside those walls? What did Korath do to him that London, and title and 4 years of careful distance never could? The answer is coming. And when it arrives, in a garden, in the spring light, with a hand that doesn't let go, you will understand exactly why this castle needed her long before he did. Stay with us. We're almost there. She returned on a Thursday, arriving at the amber hour when the moorlight made Korath look almost intentional. The Duke's carriage was still at the stables. She had told herself on the journey north that she hadn't thought about whether he would still be there. She had thought about almost nothing else. He found her in the library that evening, or she found him. It was difficult to say which. They arrived from opposite doors within moments of each other, both carrying the air of people who hadn't been looking for anyone in particular and weren't managing the coincidence especially well. It began with the garden, moved through the estate, and arrived, without either of them directing it, at something more honest than they had intended. He said Korath had been better managed in recent months than in the previous 4 years. She said it had only required attention. He said flatly that he hadn't given it any. She said she knew. The fire crackled. Neither of them moved to leave. They had developed, without naming it, a loose mourning pattern. His walk along the northern perimeter, her work in the garden, their paths crossing with a frequency slightly too consistent to be accidental. Both had chosen, by silent agreement, not to examine it too closely. She was at the rose wall when she heard him behind her. She turned, expecting the usual careful exchange. Instead, he was standing closer than usual, looking not at the garden, but at her, with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not controlled, not calculating, something unguarded. "Seraphine," he said. Not my lady. Her name without distance, as though it were a door he had only ever knocked at, and had now simply opened. "I owe you an honest conversation," he said. "I've been trying to find a way to begin it." She looked at him in the morning light, and felt, for the first time at Korath, that she was being spoken to rather than managed. "Then begin it," she said. And he did. He was called back to London on a Wednesday. A legal matter. Documents requiring his signature. Nothing that could wait. He told her at breakfast, more directly than his previous departures, and said he expected to be gone no more than 2 weeks. Then, in the way she recognized as his version of something costly, he mentioned that the groundskeeper had been instructed to assist with the garden while he was away. She walked him to the carriage without entirely knowing which of them had made that happen. They stood for a moment on the gravel in the pale morning light. He looked at the castle, as he always did before leaving, but this time he also looked at her, briefly, directly, without explanation, before stepping up into the carriage. What was different was the absence of performance. The careful machinery of his previous departures, The pointed efficiency, the indifference worn like a coat, was simply gone. He left the way a person leaves a place they mean to return to. Seraphine stood on the gravel after the carriage disappeared and understood that something had shifted that could not be shifted back. She went inside and let the knowledge settle at its own pace. London felt insufficient. That was the word he kept returning to. Not unhappy, not difficult, just insufficient. As though the city had developed a deficiency he was only now capable of detecting. His house was well run, his schedule full, his correspondence manageable. All of it felt like a precise reproduction of a life, rather than the life itself. On the fourth evening, he caught himself describing Korath to his solicitor. Not the estate in legal terms, but the library window seat, the east garden, the drawing room light. His solicitor listened carefully and said nothing. The Duke stopped mid-sentence and returned to the documents. But the damage was done. He had described Korath as a place with living qualities, which was not how he had spoken of it before she arrived, and began opening windows without asking. He returned on the 11th day, 3 days early, a fact he had decided not to examine. The carriage came through the gate at dusk, and the windows were lit as they always were now, warm and unhurried against the darkening moor. What he felt looking at them was not surprise this time. It was relief, immediate and unguarded, and entirely inconvenient for a man who had spent 4 years building a life that needed nothing. He walked inside. Mrs. Aldrin met him in the entrance hall. "Lady Ashburn is in the east garden, Your Grace." He nodded, but didn't go immediately. He stood for a moment taking in the entrance hall, the jar of spring stems on the narrow table, the open sitting room door, the firelight beyond it, the smell of beeswax that had become, without his marking the moment, simply the smell of this house. He found her at the rose wall, kneeling in the cleared earth with a trowel, entirely absorbed. She heard the gate and looked up. Her expression moved through something. Recognition, something careful, something warmer underneath. Before settling into the composed attention she brought to everything. She didn't rise immediately. She didn't move toward him. She waited, the way she always waited, as though she had long ago decided not to rearrange herself for anyone's arrival. He walked to her and extended his hand. She rose, and when they were standing level in the spring light, he didn't release it. He held it with the care of a man who has only recently understood what he's holding. "I don't want to send letters from London about what I should have said in person," he said. Seraphine looked at him, at the honest difficulty of a man choosing, for the first time in years, to move toward something rather than away from it. "Then don't," she said quietly. Along the south wall, the first rose of the season had begun to open. Neither of them noticed. They didn't need to. Every window of the castle behind them held its light, warm and steady, the way a home does when it has finally been given permission to be one. She didn't arrive at Korath asking to be loved. She arrived with a trunk that wasn't full enough, a title that was meant to diminish her, and a castle full of closed windows. And she opened them, one by one, without permission, without applause, without waiting for anyone to tell her she was allowed. If this story reached you, leave a like. It takes a second, and it tells us this kind of story is worth telling. Subscribe to DukeDom Stories, because there are more women like Seraphine waiting to be heard, and more stories like this one on the way. And if you know someone who is quietly doing the difficult, invisible work of making something beautiful out of what they were given, share this video with them today. We'll see you in the next story. Someone is already standing at a gate that hasn't been opened in years, and she's deciding whether to knock or just walk through.